All right, well, thank you for joining us today. I know people are starting to flow in right now, but I wanted to welcome you to ConservAmerica's webinar series. Today, we've got an excellent panel of experts on public land and public policy, and we're going to be talking about the issue of federal land management and federal designations for land, the different categories, special protections for land, and the pros and cons. They're often, conservation is an important thing, and conserving public areas is a great value, and there's a lot of benefits. But there's also a lot of times unintended consequences, as we like to say in Congress, and there are winners and losers. And so the purpose of this webinar is to kind of look at, some examples of unintended consequences, real life examples, and then have a conversation about maybe better approaches to how we designate conservation areas and federal protections. One that takes into account states' rights and respects private property, and really tries to work with local populations when those designations are issued. Because a lot of times, as we're going to hear today, they're handed down from 5,000 miles away, and the people on the ground don't always know about it, but they have to live with the consequences. So I wanted to introduce our esteemed panelists today. Start with Todd Myers. Thank you, Todd, for joining us from the Washington Policy Center. Hannah Downey from PERC in Montana. Nick Loris from C3, formerly Heritage, and now with C3 Solutions, with my good friend Drew Bond over there doing some good work about free market environmentalism. Mackay Campbell from Blue Water Strategies, my former boss at the U.S. Energy and Natural Resources Committee, where we dealt with a lot of these issues. And Gary Henning, city administrator of the small Alaska fishing village of King Cove, which has been wrestling with unintended consequences of federal wilderness designation for the last 41 years, since ANILCA turned the Izembek Refuge in remote Alaska into a wilderness and cut off the community of King Cove from an all-weather airport in nearby Cold Bay that the community relied on for a lot of things, but specifically emergencies and getting people out to hospital care in the Anchorage capital, the largest city in Alaska, Anchorage. Welcome to all of you, and I'd like to kick it off real quick with Gary and talking about King Cove, the situation. This is relevant. Again, you've been fighting this fight for 41 years. There have been back and forth land exchange offers with the federal government that would add wilderness land for the first time in decades in Alaska and the US. And you've always run into roadblocks. Right now, you've got a new land exchange deal on the table. It's in the Ninth Circuit Court of Appeals being considered. There's been a challenge to it from environmental groups. And I know that Senator Sullivan and Senator Murkowski have been working to get Secretary Holland up to Alaska, the Interior Secretary, to look at both King Cove and a lot of Alaska issues, because Alaska is so unique. But I don't want to, as an Alaskan, I don't want to just claim that for Alaska, because a lot of the Western states and a lot of our states are unique. So Gary, I'll let you take it from here real quick. And can you just briefly tell us what's happened in King Cove and what's been the issue since the federal land designation that made the Izembek Wilderness?
Sure, thank you, Robert. And it's a pleasure to be part of this panel. I have been the city administrator of King Cove for 31 years now, and the very first city council meeting I went to in December of '89 the top priority that the city council had then is help us figure out how we can get this road connection that we need to the Cold Bay Airport. And we've been trying ever since, and it's gone through all sorts of interesting legislation, controversy. We could spend a lot of time on the history, and I won't do that, but it really goes in quick summary back to President Eisenhower in 1960 with an executive order creating the Izembek Refuge, and then the Wilderness Act in 64 and what that had to say. And then the Native Claims Settlement Act in 71, that was significant in that the King Cove Aleut Corporation was trying to select lands in the refuge, which in those days we didn't know much about, and found out that there was a conflict with wilderness designations, which nobody in King Cove even knew what that meant in those days. And then certainly ANILCA in 1980 made the formal reality of 300,000 acres of the Izembek Refuge would be wilderness. And that was 300,000 acres out of a total of 315,000. So there wasn't a whole lot of non-wilderness land set aside. So in King Cove's case, we've been there since the early 1900s. It's a Aleut community. World War II is why the big airport in Cold Bay got built. It got built by the military, along with a lot of the elders in King Cove. Elders now, actually most of them have now passed on. So we got this big airport and set in about 30 miles away, but King Cove cannot have regular dependable access because of the weather. There's 100 days a year you can't fly in or out of King Cove, and you can take a boat some of those days, but when the weather is blowing 60, 70, 80 miles an hour, being on a boat is also not something anybody wants to do. So there's a long story of lives that have been lost because we couldn't get people to Cold Bay. Cold Bay is our lifeline to Anchorage and the rest of the world. We've had people die on the boats going over to Cold Bay, people getting off the boats at the very precarious dock in Cold Bay. We have had 140 medevacs since December 22nd in 2013, which is the same day when Secretary Jewell said, no, you can't have this road, you can't have the land exchange. So life for people in King Cove has been severely compromised because of this designation of federal lands. We have tried a number of measures with Congress to try and remedy that. We have made some progress, but we still don't have ultimately what we need, which is to finish a 13-mile, one-lane gravel road that would connect the city of King Cove to the Cold Bay Airport. And if we could have access to that Cold Bay Airport 95% of the time, which we believe that road would give us, then our life can be a lot more normal in terms of getting to where we need to go, which again is to Cold Bay so that we can access Anchorage. So I'll just sort of leave that as my initial summary and would sum it up to say it has been a controversy that has dominated my time working for King Cove. Everyone in King Cove just says, we're not second-class citizens. How come our own government doesn't help us? What is it they don't see that we see about our problem? And do we really matter? You know, are we such a small, unforgotten community out here at the western end of the Alaska Peninsula that nobody really cares about us? We think our life is just as important as anybody in mainstream America. And thank goodness that we have had wonderful support from the congressional delegation for all these years and from state government. And in Alaska, it's a no-brainer to us that it's an issue that we believe the federal government ought to be able to resolve quite quickly. But we have come to realize in the last 30 years that that's just not the case.
Well, Gary, thank you. And I will back up real quick and say, you know, ANILCA created, when ANILCA was designated with the Alaska lands, Mackay, help me if you got the ANOCA.
The Alaska National Interest Lands Conservation Act.
There
That's
we go.
correct.
Designated, I mean, a huge swath, almost half of Alaska as public lands. Much of it wilderness, was the largest wilderness designation for the nation. And, you know, I've been trying to share a map here of King Cove and failing, so technology is not my strong suit. But King Cove is located, 800 miles from Anchorage down in the peninsula?
625 miles,
So
625. Yeah.
625 miles from Anchorage, which is the state's largest city. Also, you know, a good 4,500 miles from Washington, D.C. You know, community of about a little under 1,000. And, you know, the reason we're talking about King Cove, not only because it's close to my heart, as we've been working on it for years, but it really is a good example of how, you know, well-intentioned bureaucrats and political leaders in Washington, D.C. can make a designation about public lands and putting away some of our special places and really make mistakes and have unintended consequences of the people that live there. This is a very remote area. It's a very small community. And when you're a very small, remote community, you kind of can get steamrolled, you know, by these big designations, because there's a lot of special interest groups nationally that have a lot of interest in designating these special areas. And they have a lot more power in Washington and a lot more sway a lot of times. You know, when it comes, you know, Alaska has 2 senators, it has 1 congressman. And, you know, a lot of times there's a lot more interest at the national level because these conservation areas are popular. You know, I know that, like I said before, the senators are working hard to get Secretary Holland up there to see it. You know, and I wish, you know, all the luck that when she comes out there, she'll see the importance of finding a compromise. Mackay, you know, as you know the history of King Cove, also, you know, worked on a lot of federal land designations for the committee. We've done a lot of wilderness. We've done a lot of exchanges. Is there something unique about some of them, or when you would weigh them at the committee when you were staff director of the Energy Committee for Chairman Murkowski? You know, what considerations would you look at? What policy kind of check the boxes would you go before you'd make, you know, a bill that would designate land as, well, you know, wilderness is the most restrictive, but there are other designations that also restrict use from the public.
Yeah. Let's see. Dylan, can you hear me? I don't know if you can see me.
Yeah, we can see. Oh, am I not on screen, or am I?
You just have the big map up still.
Oh, okay, good. Well, I was able to share the screen. Well, great.
There we go.
All right, good.
Anyway.
It did not show on my side.
No problem. I was going to say, you know, something I know you've heard her say this as well, but something Senator Murkowski likes to say is the only law that Congress is really good at is the law of unintended consequences. And I think the King Cove Road situation is an excellent example of that. You know, there's, as Gary was just touching on, there's an extensive network of roads over on the Cold Bay side that are left over from the Korean War, from the Vietnam War, and the about 70, almost all government employees who live over there use those roads extensively. But there's no way to get the residents of King Cove, if one was injured in a medevac, to get them to the all-weather airport, the 3rd biggest in Alaska, and fly them out, other than a very harrowing boat ride, which I've done in rough weather, and you don't want to be doing it. In this case, when Congress made this area a wilderness, I don't think any of them had a clue that they would be blocking, you know, life or death medevacs. And I'm not exaggerating here. Unfortunately, there have been a whole series of deaths because of this. And so I don't think they had a clue about doing that. But once it was capital W wilderness, in my view, a lot of the opposition to the road comes from not any actual impacts of the potential road. It's a very, very minimal impacts, but rather what groups worry about the precedent of us putting a road through an established wilderness. And so when you're looking at land designations, you have to really hope that people on both sides of the aisle in committee and stuff where they're doing the homework are spend a lot of time looking about what are the actual consequences to people who live there. You know, this may sound grand on a national scale, but what are the actual impacts of the people who live there? And that's something we always tried to pay attention to. I hope we did well when we were at the committee.
Thank you. You know, broader, I don't know if you can see the slide. Can you see the slide that shows the picture of King Cove right now, or are you looking at me? Okay, all right. Am I on the screen then?
You are.
I do not understand why that's happening, but anyway. Well, good. Well, I will show, if I can later, I'll show that slide that really shows that King Cove is between, you know, two very large mountains. And are they both active volcanoes, Gary, or just?
Just one of them, Mount Dutton is the active volcano.
Well, that's, you know, I don't know anybody else, but one active volcano is enough in the neighborhood. But I wanted to bring this, I wanted to widen this conversation. And Gary, I guess the next thing is you're in the Ninth Circuit, you're trying to get the secretary up to Alaska. She's going to have to make a determination of whether this land exchange is in the best interest of the public.
Correct.
And when do you have a timeline of when you're hoping to get a decision?
Well, for us, we would like the secretary to give us a thumbs up just as quick as possible. We don't realistically think that would happen until she makes the trip to King Cove, which we now are being led to believe that the middle of October, when the Senate is in recess for, I think it's Indigenous Day, whatever the old Columbus holiday has been renamed, that the secretary schedule will allow her to come to Alaska if there's no COVID restrictions. It's also very important for lots of reasons that Senator Murkowski be able to accompany her, and that's what we are sort of hoping for. So interestingly, in my discussions with the Interior Department, they have asked us when the secretary makes it to King Cove to set aside time for a press conference, and we're finding that pretty unique, thinking that the secretary wanting to have a press conference in King Cove would not come there to say something negative. But, you know, no one has said I can assume that. That's just what we want to believe is the case, but time will tell, and the sooner the better.
Well, I hope that, you know, 30 days brings resolution to this 41-year-old challenge and struggle. I really do. Makai, did you want to add something?
Just very, very briefly. I was out there when we got David Hayes to back when David was Deputy Secretary of Interior in the Obama administration. We got him to come out, and after visiting at King Cove, we got in a plane with the superintendent of the Izembek Refuge, flew all around and looked at it from the air. He asked her, he said, what's your single biggest concern about that? And she said, well, I'm just concerned if there's a road, it might have just a devastating impact on the brown bear. I'm very concerned about that. So we went that night to Cold Bay, spent the night at the Cold Bay Lodge there, had dinner. Afterwards, got a pickup. And this was when the pinks are running in the streams. And we drove around and looked at when the pinks were running, the bears were all in. We saw well over 50 bears that evening. From ranges from maybe 50 yards up to 5 yards, where we were rolling up the windows pretty quickly. And afterwards I said, David, I suppose I don't need to belabor the point, but you know, of these bears we saw, we watched every one of them from a road, which didn't seem to be bothering them at all.
Yeah, I mean, there is a deep, long history of issues and back and forth over 41 years of, you know, of offers and counter offers and issues. It's very complicated story in some ways and a very simple story in others. But I think, it comes down to the essence, which, leads us to a broader discussion is, like, if you can see, I think you can see right now, the picture of King Cove. King Cove's that little sliver of land in between the two mountains. One of them, as Gary pointed out, is an active volcano in a very gorgeous setting, which a lot of us would like to protect and make sure it stays that way, including the Aleut, Alaska Native Aleut of the region, who've taken care of the land for 10,000 years. But the important thing here is, while conserving this area is important, there has to be some flexibility that respects and prioritizes human life and human activity, along with protecting conservation and animals. And I think, we're smart, we can do both. I think that if you look at, turn to Hannah and places like Montana and Todd and places like Oregon, I think we've done a decent job, of striking that balance. And I think we can do that in Alaska. Hannah, I want to turn to Hannah and take this on a bit broader conversation now about federal designations and public land management.
Awesome. Well, thanks for having me. And I can say I haven't been to Kings Cove, so I can't speak directly to that experience, but I do think the lessons and the broader topics that King Cove raises of how do we involve local communities in land management designations? How do we find balance and strive to understand that there are trade-offs when we make these sorts of decisions, and they impact humans, they impact nature. And so ultimately, yes, that balance is a very hard thing to find. And so I know there's lots of us on this call today who have more to say on this, but one of my biggest takeaways, as we've seen in Montana and throughout the West in designations that I've looked at, is where we've really seen success and where we've really been able to see kind of lasting results is when we do have a more collaborative input process. Right now in Montana and in Bozeman, where I live, we've been going through a forest management plan rewrite, and we've seen a really great collaborative effort come out of that. Has it been hard? Absolutely. Has it been long? Yes. But that is the hope, that when we're able to actually collaboratively do that and bring those many voices to the table, that's where we can see a lasting impact. One of the biggest, I think, the other side of the table there is when we look at things like monument designations, when they're being made completely unilaterally without congressional input. Just the president can, with a stroke of his pen, place restrictions on how land is used, and that has maybe been historically used for grazing or timber or any sorts of local uses, and local economies depend on that. And so when you just have one power come in and make that decision without trying to balance in those local inputs and appreciate it and bringing in those local voices more often, that's where we see a lot of controversy, whereas those collaborative approaches have had more success. So that's kind of my biggest takeaway, and how we can apply these lessons of King Cove to a broader landscape is thinking about how do we promote collaboration. And I know Todd and Nick might also have some great ideas from where they are of how we can actually move forward with that collaboration.
Yeah, go ahead, Todd.
So let me just add to that. I think one of the challenges is anytime you have government regulation, there are going to be unintended consequences. There's going to be unintended consequences in life. The planning approach, though, relies on making the claim that planners and people who do the environmental impact statements know what they're doing. So unintended consequences are almost run counter to that and are a rebuttal. And so sometimes it is difficult for people who have developed a plan to admit that there were unintended consequences, because it undermines their authority to make the plan in the first place. And the result is that we don't actually know all the time whether environmental analyses are accurate. Here in Washington State, for example, we had a situation where one of the heads of the Department of Ecology, I asked him, okay, have you ever gone back and looked at the environmental impact statements to see whether the impacts that you predicted occurred? And he said, no, we've never gone back and ground truthed. That's, I think, pretty fundamental. And when you have that mindset, the question is, how do you deal with those unintended consequences? And really the way to do it is collaboration, I think, is the first step. But the real way to do that is to give more authority to the people in the local communities to actually take action. A good example of that is across the West with forest fires. So there's obviously a big issue with unhealthy forests and forest fires. But where you see some of the best work being done on forest management and forest fires are actually on tribal reservations. Tribes, although the Bureau of Indian Affairs has a lot of oversight, tribes have a greater degree of political authority to do some of the things that they want to do on their own reservations and manage those lands, not just for economic benefit, for environmental benefit. And so in cases like King Cove, where, as you said, Dylan, that the decisions are being made more than 4,000 miles away and not by the people on the ground, there is a strong disincentive for folks to admit that they made mistakes and that there were unintended consequences, especially since they don't feel the cost of those consequences. So while collaboration, I think, is an important first step, the more authority you can give to folks on the ground, not just to meet their economic and health concerns, but to help preserve the brown bear and things like that. And I'll just finish with this. For those who are on the webinar who aren't Alaskans, while rolling up your window for a brown bear is useful, it is not the only thing you should do when they get close.
True.
Nick, I'm gonna let you go first, but I'd like to circle back, Todd, and for the whole group, about examples of that local authority and how we can delegate that down, because Congress doesn't like to do that. Congress likes to take the authority up. And I know, we've talked, Senator Murkowski and the committee talked for years about looking at prior policies that have been enacted and seeing, if they needed updated, they needed revised, what the consequences were. And there's never any incentive to do that, because the way I put it, there's no ribbon cutting for anybody to go to. There's no stakeholders and no special interest groups that are urging Congress to go back and look at things they did before and see if they worked. Right? And it's really hard to get them to do that.
Well, being from Washington, D.C., there's few examples of that going on. There's actually one that I can turn to, and that's Lincoln's Cottage here in Washington, D.C., which is a national monument and a national historic landmark. But it's run by an independent 501c3 as part of a cooperative agreement with the Armed Forces Retirement Home there and the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And they've done a lot of work, fundraising, and actually taking ownership of the stewardship of that cottage, which had been closed for the longest time. They went through an 8-year renovation project, and now it's turned out to be extremely successful. And you have those people who are kind of more accountable, making the good decisions and actually spending the money the way that it should be spent. But to back up a little bit, because I know Hannah and Todd have much better examples than that, I will say what's been discussed so far is very much in line with what the Biden administration had proposed for its 30 by 30 report. It was, that they have this plan to conserve 30% of America's lands and waters by 2030. And whether you agree whether or not that is something that should be done, the principles within that document are very much in line with what folks on this webinar have already talked about, pursuing a collaborative and inclusive approach for conservation, supporting locally led and locally designed conservation efforts, using science as a guide, and building on existing tools and strategies with an emphasis on flexibility and adaptive approaches. And I think that's what we need for a lot of these decisions that are being made in places like Washington or Oregon, or with something like King Cove, and especially in a place like King Cove, where, Gary, I imagine the majority of people who live there, I think it's about 1,000 or so, support building the road. You've got support from the entire congressional delegation, yet you have lawyers and environmental activists and people in DC are the ones who are holding it up. So I just want to echo everything that's been said so far. Is the more we can empower the people who are most impacted by these decisions, the better off these communities are going to be economically and environmentally.
And I think bouncing off that point, Nick, I'm seeing some interesting messages in the chat and such referencing the Utah monument designations. And that I think is a really interesting opportunity when we talk about how do we bring things from collaborative to like actually having management control on the ground or direct input in that capacity. And the Utah monuments are a really interesting case for me in that a lot of the push for designation of Grand Staircase and Bears Ears and the subsequent back and forth between Obama, Trump, and Biden administrations on just how much land that should take up and how wide ranging those monument designations should be is the importance of tribal interests on that landscape. And so one of the things that has really kind of peeved me about these designations, no matter which administration is doing it, is that yes, tribal nations have had advisory roles regarding how these monuments are designated and some of their management, but they haven't actually been active managers in that roles. They've been advisors. And so one of the things that I would really like to see to help us move more from collaboration to actual on the ground outcomes would be to say, how do we involve those tribal nations that have this vested interest in how these landscapes are managed? How do we empower them to actually do some of this management? How do we make it so that it's not just, okay, we have these advisory councils and they come together and brainstorm and those ideas go to DC and the Bureau of Land Management or the Forest Service. And then ultimately those land managers at a federal level decide what's happening on the ground. How could we actively allow those tribal groups to manage this land that is so important to them? And so that's just one example, but I think that's a really interesting case that we're seeing right now. Some of the Biden administration plans for those monuments should be coming up hopefully soon. But I think that's a really interesting opportunity where we could see that direct local management, where the people who have the interest in conserving those resources are able to actively manage for it.
And I'll jump on that because I think in Alaska, we have done some of that, especially in Southeast and Southwest, where they've been cooperative agreements where the tribal groups have been hired to manage some of the remote refuges have got agreements. But I'd also caution that I think in Alaska, and I hate to always go to Alaska, but it's the backyard for me, as Mackay and Gary, is that there is a tendency that as long as the tribal priorities correspond with the environmental or the administration's priorities, I would argue that the Inupiat of the North Slope have not always felt they've got a fair shake out of Congress on Anwar, which is their traditional homeland, and the Aleut in King Cove, feeling the same. And Alaska is complicated because we don't have reservations for the most part. There are small exceptions, and not to get into the history of Indian policy, but Alaska came after the reservation policy era and led to basically a cash settlement for land rights and the creation of Alaska Native owned but Western style corporations. But so I think there is some of that at least happening in Alaska, where you've got management happening at least on a certain level, but also I'm not sure those voices are always equally heard as well.
I think they're heard if they agree and ignored if they don't.
Mackay and I are very jaded individuals. I'm sorry.
Yeah.
Too long. I don't know how Nick keeps his optimism.
No, I think the point you guys are raising, though, is exactly spot on and gets to this idea of trade-offs, where if local communities, be it tribal or otherwise, actively have a role in the management of these things, that's when then you're able to say, okay, you actively have a management role, not just advisory. So your voice can either be listened to or not, but like your voice is able to be actively engaged in this management. And I think we're seeing a lot of that controversy, like here in the West, especially where I am, with conflicts over what designations and more protective designations, environmentally stringent designations mean for traditional uses, grazing permits being a huge one. And so again, I think it's very, very difficult to decide exactly how we do these things. But one thing that I think holds more promise is when we do see these strict designations. And again, we can debate whether those designations should be happening or not, but at least when we do see these designations happening, there's some opportunity for flexibility with some of those permits, either being grandfathered in or giving some of those like grazing permit holders the opportunity to be bought out by a third party for an agreed upon price. And so that, I think, is maybe a move in the right direction, where we're able to at least see, recognizing, hey, this is how your local community has traditionally used these landscapes. We can either grandfather you in or help pay to compensate for this foregone use of the landscape. Again, debating whether those designations are right or wrong in the first place aside, that might be a tool that we're able to use moving forward to hopefully at least recognize some of those local needs and interests.
Yeah, and just 30,000 foot here, in Alaska, we suffer because we're a very beautiful landscape, very remote. It's very, people look at it. I think people always look at Alaska as like, I want to go there someday and I want it to be like it is, well, like it was, like it is today. And our remoteness works against us, that everybody wants Alaska to be preserved because they see it as a special place, but don't have any relationship with the people. In the West, you've got some of that, but you also have a migration issue where you have a changing populace and more people moving into the West that don't have those same working landscape values. They're not cattle ranchers. They're not, they didn't grow up on horse farms or, use the land. And their relationship with the landscape is much different. And so you've got a clash of values, and understanding, how we build, and this is separate from federal policy, but it is the story that I hear a lot of the Western senators and representatives and the governors making, is that we have to respect that we have different values and different historical perspectives, and that the land can be worked, can, benefit our prosperity, but also be protected and conserved for future generations. And that's a real challenge.
I think that there's additional layer to that, though. I think that there is a clash of values and those trade-offs that Hannah talked about. But I think that sometimes, even after you do the collaboration, you agree, okay, yes, we're going to have some from column A and some from column B. We're going to have these trade-offs. But implementing those on the ground is difficult. How you actually get it and achieve that balance, that's, I think, the real challenge in planning from afar, even if you have agreement about what the goals are. And that, I think, is where the real value of having people locally making those decisions. So, for instance, Hannah talked about grazing. Grazing, in a lot of cases, has been assumed to be environmentally destructive, but now we're finding that grazing actually is part of reducing the risk of wildfire and other things like that. So that's new information, right? That's not something that you can say, oh, they should have known this, right? So now we have this new information. How do we deal with that, even if we have agreed and shared values and goals? Waiting for people 4,000 miles away or Congress to internalize that, think about it, and then apply it, it takes too long. It's not possible. So it's not merely that we need to have local people involved so that we can get those shared values. It is also that we need to have local people involved to implement them in a timely way, in a way that actually lives up to the values that everybody claims that they have agreed upon. So I think again and again, where we see this, and there is some recognition of this at the federal level, for when it comes to forest management, we recognize that we have a huge problem in our forests of not being able to do the work that needs to get done to make our forests healthy again. The irony is that we don't change the rules. What we do is we create new rules to get around those rules. And so we've created something called Good Neighbor Authority, which basically allows local states and other organizations to implement the rules in a way that is more efficient than the federal Forest Service. So this is not a foreign concept. It's just that we never quite seem to implement it in the way that makes sense, which is why we need to put more control in the local hands. Because my guess is that Gary and the Native Corporation in King Cove don't have any interest whatsoever in harming brown bears, but they probably can do it in such a way that makes sure that their members, the community members, aren't dying from things that are essentially preventable.
Okay, go ahead.
Yeah, I have a friend who made an observation, which I've come to believe is true. He said, if America had been settled from west to east, all of New England would probably be a great national park now. I think one of the things as we look at the issue of federal lands is we need to pay attention to the issue of the percentage of public lands in the different states and the dramatic difference between the East Coast and some of the other states and the big Western public land states. For instance, Rhode Island, as an example, has 0.8% public lands. Nevada has 81.1%. Utah 66.5, Alaska 61.8. There's just a dramatic difference. I think it's the old saying about if you're sharing a bed with a hippopotamus, no matter how friendly you want to, when it rolls over, it's a problem. That's the issue with public land states where the federal government ownership is the hippopotamus. And as we look at federal land designations, we have to, pay a lot of attention to that and the impacts, I think.
And unfortunately, this is an issue that gets, very politicized and becomes very partisan very quickly. But I guess, Hannah, I looked like you were going to talk, but I was just going to ask, what other examples do we have of, devolving the authority to the states? Having been a veteran of some of these battles, you're immediately going to get a cry from national groups that, state X is just going to destroy all its public lands, if you let them run it. And that it's a silly notion that I always think of New Jersey, it's called the Garden State, but I don't know if you've ever been to New Jersey, not to offend New Jersey, but I'm sorry. I'd rather live out west and trust a lot of the governors out there to manage the public estate. But I'm just wondering if we think we can do this transfer of power down and a more of a power sharing cooperative approach to our public lands.
Yeah. And just for the record, 3.7% of public lands in New Jersey.
I think the irony of concern about saying that people in whatever state won't protect their own land, it sort of reminds me of the line from Animal House where it says, they can't do that to our pledges, only we can do that to our pledges. It's like they can't destroy their lands, only we can destroy their lands. And I think that is the problem, is the assumption that somehow federal management is more protective environmentally than state and local management, when we see again and again, it's exactly the opposite. Whether it's forests or invasive species or a variety of other things that come off of federal lands. And if you talk to federal land managers, they admit this. They admit a frustration in their inability to manage it. And yet the assumption seems to continue that federal management is superior to local management, when we just see that's not true.
I think Todd's point on Good Neighbor Authority as an example of where we're seeing states and federal partners actually come together to do some stuff. Good Neighbor Authority is an incredible tool that allows states to offer some of their resources to help manage federal forests. Another example, I think, is with state management of wildlife. Very often people think that, well, if a species isn't protected under the Endangered Species Act, it's just kind of off on its own, floating, at risk of doom. But to my knowledge, actually, so when there is not a species that has been delisted under the Federal Endangered Species Act that has then gone to state management that has had populations drop so low to a point where they are subsequently relisted. Perhaps someone has an example that can prove me wrong, but to my knowledge, the vast majority, if not all of species that have returned to state management have continued to stay at healthy population levels. Montana, we've seen that with the gray wolf. We're seeing that with the grizzly bear, even though it is still federally listed as threatened. Our state has been very active, along with our neighboring Greater Yellowstone ecosystem states, in trying to actively recover and restore and partner with our federal partners to actually do conservation there. So I think there's enough examples that showcase, states and local communities and individual landowners aren't setting out to try and destroy everything. We're actually very well equipped and have seen really good successes at making some of this happen.
Well, and just to make a quick historical reference, I think that this idea that, economic development has always been in conflict with conservation and land management. I think a lot of that comes from exploitive industries that were actually coming in from outside of the state back when there were territories, whether it was the East Coast, and we're going to pick on New England here, New England whalers going to Alaska, right, to hunt the bowhead and the whales, where there was destruction there. It wasn't the Alaskans that were managing their hunting, the Alaska Natives specifically, or the Russian fur trade and fur seals all along the West Coast, including Oregon and Washington, but also in Alaska. Those, a lot of times what you had seen is outsiders that came in and didn't have that relationship with the local land to really take care of it. And so now that, we've got states, we've got populations in these states that not everyone is a grazer or a rancher, and not everyone there is a mixed use of group. A lot of these Western states are really booming, including Alaska, for tourism and recreation. There's a really mixed use population, and they're the best ones to find that balance. It's really hard to do that from a national level. Okay.
And I think, I'm sorry not to interrupt, but I think that probably Nick, not to put Nick on the spot, but he has some good examples of that, which is the frustration of the inconsistency, right? That people from the outside allow some things, but not others. And I think energy siting, right? Siting of windmills, where you don't allow other things. So some political priorities, they bend the rules for them, but others they don't. And I think that further undermines that notion that the federal authorities can be trusted or know what they're doing better than the local folks.
Yeah, that's a great point, Todd. And we've seen it in Alaska with ANWR. We've seen it with even something like the Keystone XL pipeline. And I think it gets back to this overarching problem of when the federal government gets to make a national interest or public interest determination, because there's going to be some subjectivity in that decision, and they can use science as a guiding tool as much as they want, and they can chat with the state and local communities about that project. And despite overwhelming support from state and local communities for the development of natural resources, or for the construction of a pipeline, or the development of a wind farm or a solar array for that matter, the agency or administration can make a decision that it's not in the public interest and therefore can't go forward, and therefore greater weight and subjectivity is given to what the agency wants rather than what the state and local community wants. And I think it gets back to Todd's point about we need some sort of real systemic reform that actually empowers these local communities to be in charge here, because too often I think there's a problem recognition and then you see some sort of signed executive order or some sort of agreement that doesn't actually do the dirty work to actually lead to reforms that we would want to see for better economic and environmental management. Even something like forest management, whether it's been on federal or state lands. You know, there was a recent story in NPR about Florida leading the way on prescribed burns and burning, I think, 1.6 million acres this year to keep their forests healthy and to prevent any wildfires in the southeast. And being from the east, I'll give some credit to the eastern part of the country. Whereas that's just very difficult to do in places like California and Oregon. And they're starting to make some progress on some state reforms to limit liability to allow for more prescribed burns. But there's just so much more work that needs to be done to implement systemic reforms to actually put local people in power.
Go ahead, Mackay.
2 quick points. One, I want to go back and thank Hannah very much for her plug for state fish and game agencies. I used to run the Alaska Department of Fish and Game, and we strongly felt that we did a good job, and we did a job that was responsive to the local people. Alaska, one of the driving factors in Alaska becoming the state was the federal management or mismanagement of the salmon stocks and their allowance of fish traps that basically were about ready to decimate the salmon stocks before we took over. Second, I also want to clarify when I was mentioning public land states versus those states with very small amounts of public land. I tremendously enjoyed living in a public land state. I think it's a great asset. I think it's, frankly, there are many things about it that are just much better. The challenge, though, becomes when you're dealing with remote management of those public lands. And even if you have a superintendent, for instance, who is doing an excellent job, in 3 years, they're going to transfer somewhere else to a different part of the federal system. And you don't have time where you develop people who live there, who are part of the communities, a part of the state, and to work with the people.
Well, and I, to Nick's point, it's not only, you mentioned Anwar and the pipeline, Trans-Canada pipeline. It's not always big controversial issues either. Bird strikes by wind turbines were treated differently under the Obama administration and may still be compared to other killing other migratory birds, right? There was, the thumb was put on the scale. And we just lost Mackay, unfortunately. Hopefully he'll join back in. But I did want to highlight real quick for King Cove that there is some, Gary, you guys just went, well, it's been a couple of years now, but you've been 100% renewable energy for your community using run of river, using the mountains and the waterfall off those mountains to generate electricity, which has allowed you to cut pollution and greenhouse gas emissions out in the community, right? So.
That's correct. We are the most prolific microgrid any place in Alaska, perhaps in the lower 48, where on an annual basis, 90% of all of our energy in King Cove comes from our 2 small run-of-the-river hydros. And that's a big deal that we have the cheapest cost of electricity any place in rural Alaska, simply because we've made some large investments in the infrastructure to let Mother Nature provide this energy for us. And we spend a lot of time trying to point this out to the people who oppose the road, trying to show that we are good stewards of the land. We live within the bounds of what Mother Nature has given us. Where if we get the road, the ability to drive through the Izembek Refuge to get to the Cold Bay Airport, we're not going to be damaging the black brant, the brown bear, the tundra swan, all the things that the environmental community are so up in arms about, that they don't trust the Aleut people of King Cove to be good stewards of the resources that they've lived with for thousands of years. That's the part of this that becomes, for a long time, it's become very insulting to the people in King Cove. But just a couple other comments spill over from what we've talked about. Another thing that we've observed, the career bureaucrats in U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, this becomes a religion to them, that this is wilderness. We don't much care about what that wilderness designation has meant to the people in King Cove. And we're constantly fighting that issue that you got to care because it's our life. We are important. And please, at least be willing to meet us halfway, or at least understand what our perspective is on these various things. Case in point, in my time, there's been at least 8 different refuge managers at the Izembek Refuge. Only one of those have ever come to King Cove, as far as I know. And we're talking about a 15-minute plane ride from Cold Bay over to King Cove. Congressman Young, to his credit, back a bunch of years ago, was talking about passing legislation. Let's just move the Izembek Refuge Office over to King Cove. Let's let those folks see what it's like to operate out of King Cove. And in hindsight, I wish the congressman would have, moved forward on that idea, but I'm sure it would have probably had its own challenges. The last thing I want to say is the government to government relationship is so superficial and so fanarky for us in King Cove that we have had our elders tell their stories of the history, how things happen, the people that have experienced these health crises by not getting out of town. And it gets written up into a nice report, but it doesn't go anyplace. It doesn't help us. So the people in King Cove very much are suspicious of the federal government. The folks in U.S. Fish and Wildlife, they ask for our stories, we tell them our stories, and that's sort of where it ends. So we've had a fair amount of frustration just trying to be good citizens, but we don't see that always being reciprocated from the federal land managers that we have to deal with in Izembek.
Well, I hope the people of King Cove can find resolution. I know that there is a solution out there that will, can balance the importance of human life in King Cove and the region, and still protect the black brant and the migrating birds that come through that area, and maintain, in fact, expand the wilderness, not shrink it at all. It's just a small exchange. I think one of the things too, I want to make a point off this is this inflexibility that we see. And I know we've been kind of hard on federal bureaucrats. They probably deserve it, but they're not all bad. We've got lots of friends that are federal bureaucrats too. So I want to put a plug that there's some good eggs out there as well. But this inflexibility erodes support for these federal land designations, among members of Congress. And it really does create a dividing line when what we need is more solutions that can devolve authority down to the state level and have federal state partnerships and state and local partnerships, but then also a greater stakeholder process that involves the community, with Congress much more. So we got a couple minutes. I don't do a quick round robin. If anybody has any closing statements, I want to thank everybody for coming today. It's been a good conversation.
Well, I would close and say that King Cove once again does remain hopeful that the current secretary, who we've already had one virtual Zoom session with, clearly showed some emotional reaction to hearing some of the real stories that have shaped our frustrations in King Cove. And we've sort of been here before, having Secretary of the Interior types acting like they feel our pain and they're going to help. This time, we believe, maybe because of the uniqueness of the current secretary's background, this might be the right time. And certainly with Senator Murkowski being our major cheerleader and advocate for a couple decades now, we feel that the chemistry is once again as good as it may ever be. So we remain hopeful.
All right, well, we wish you all the luck, and we'll be watching, Gary. Nick, any last thoughts?
No, I just thank you for inviting me to participate. This is a great discussion. Best of luck to you, Gary. I'll steal one little remark that I got from Hannah's colleague, Holly Fretwell, and a point you made earlier, Robert, that I think sometimes we think of these conservation areas as museums that we want to put behind glass and just keep locked up like that forever, when we know that nature is constantly evolving and the desires of communities are constantly evolving, and the more we can have flexibility and local empowerment, the better off the health of these environments are going to be.
Anna?
I'll echo Nick. Thanks so much, everyone, for the conversation, and agreed. Best of luck, Gary. Completely agreed. I think there have been some comments on how this in the chat on how this emphasizes the urban rural divide and how that's been a consistent theme throughout this webinar. But I also hope a theme that's come out throughout this webinar is that people oftentimes we agree on that we want to see conservation. We want to look out for humans. So we have a lot of shared common goals. And so I'm lightly optimistic that as we continue to emphasize that we have those common goals, that we do value human lives and environmental conservation, that hopefully that can bring these different sides together, the urban, the rural, no matter what party you belong to or side of the political aisle. And hopefully we can move forward if at least we're able to acknowledge we share those common goals.
Well said. Thank you. Todd, I'm save the last word for Makai, but Todd.
Yeah, so I think what you said, Robert, is exactly right. This is not about bureaucrats. As being a former state environmental agency staffer, I know there's a lot of folks who really care a lot about managing it, but it's very difficult when their incentives and feedback are not aligned with what's going on the ground, and they're distant. And they often are frustrated. I know I've worked with many people in the Forest Service who are trying to do the right thing and manage those forests and are frustrated by the restrictions that they have. The key is not the people all the time. It is the situation that they are put in and the incentives and where the decisions are being made. And like I said, the reason I give the example of tribal communities is because they have a greater deal of autonomy and authority over their own lands. And so they're a good example of what can be done for the communities and for the environment when that authority is localized and when they can make those decisions. And in many cases, especially we see in forest health, they make very good decisions. I think that's the bigger key than sort of shaking our fist at bureaucrats we don't like, because if we put those staffers in a bad situation, we shouldn't be surprised that there are bad outcomes.
Okay.
Yeah. Well, I'm going to bring us back to King Cove to close out. And I'd say, you know, there's a real difference between real and virtual. And the virtual we've been able to use today to bring us all together. It's a wonderful gift. But so often what happens is a virtual or a myth about a place from people who haven't been there takes hold and is in sharp contrast to the reality. If you're at King Cove and you're trying to either get in or come out, even on a marginal day at the airport, you'll never want to do it again. If you're in a boat and you're coming around from King Cove to Cold Bay and you're taking solid green water across the cabin every wave, you don't ever want to do it again. If you're coming up that latch, 20-some foot, totally vertical steel ladder to the Cold Bay dock, as they've had to bring pregnant women up in going into labor, you never want to have that situation again. Those are realities. And the challenge for all of us, I think, is to make sure the realities of on-ground management break through the myths that sometimes are such a problem to using land properly.
Thank you. Well, we are over our time. I thank everybody who stayed with us, and I thank all of you guys for joining us. We will be watching Gary. Hopefully, you know, soon there'll be a positive resolution, and we'll be there, you know, regardless with you. Todd, we look forward to hearing more about, you know, how we can get these local management issues. You know, if anybody has any recent writings or recent publications or reports on this from PERC, I know PERC has done some stuff. Todd, you've done some writing. Send them in and we'll post them when we get this webinar up on the website. It'll take me about 24 hours, but we will have this on demand, and we'll be happy to post those links to your great work as well. Thank you all, and enjoy the rest of your week.